right, well, thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon panel where we'll talk about GCC and Asia distressed debt markets. So as our introduction has just said, it's a very interesting time to be talking about distressed debt markets in general across the globe. But we want to focus on this region, which has seen some transformative events in the past few years, not least because of the new bankruptcy codes that have been implemented across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and in India, all in the case of 5-6 years. So our panel would like to discuss what these have meant for both investors and companies operating in the region, and how this helps resolve debt restructurings. So perhaps we can start with Berkay, who leads Middle Eastern investors for SC Lowy, an international investment firm. Berkay, what have these bankruptcy codes meant for investors like yourself? How has this changed your vision of the region and your operations within it?
Yeah, sure. I think over the last, let's say, since 2018, 2019, we've seen a number of test cases come across different jurisdictions in the region. Obviously, in Saudi, you had Al Ghuseiba brothers. That was a big case, landmark case, showed that the Saudi bankruptcy regime actually works. You can get an FRP and you can get the company out of the restructuring, and actually creditors can get proceeds. In Bahrain, you had Garmco, which is a similar case, where the first test of the Bahraini insolvency law, and it worked quite well as well. This company successfully emerged from the in-court process. And obviously in UAE, you had I would say, a landmark case in NMC, which actually used the ADGM process, where very complex situation and large number of lenders and a very sensitive operating company successfully come in and out of the administration process, where you managed to preserve the business, you managed to actually serve the public as well through COVID, through the depths of the pandemic, and also creditors ended up getting some recoveries as a part of a very successful restructuring. And for an investor's perspective, right, when you look into a jurisdiction and you see a number of successful test cases, it gives you confidence, not only as a distressed investor, but also a private debt investor or direct lender. Whichever way you look at it, you want to make sure that if things go wrong for whatever reason, there's actually a framework that allows recoveries and everybody to be able to find a solution commercially and in a value-constructive way rather than value-destructive way. And I think from GCC's perspective, we've seen a number of successful cases that makes us more confident.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Dilip, you also obviously operate in this space, have a lot of years experience in the market. How do you see these bankruptcy codes transforming the environment for distressed debt in the region?
I think it's been incredibly transformative on a few levels. I mean, let's also think about why have we had these bankruptcy codes come in within this bandwidth, right? Mm-hmm. So think about it. This region, as we're describing, has a tremendous demographic dividend, right? If you try to come up with a percentage, maybe 60% of the population is under the age of 35. So they need to create jobs here, right? Governments can't create all the jobs that are required. So you need to have a regime that will allow people to take risk, startups, you need to create a venture community. That is clearly one of the drivers here. The other thing is you need foreign direct investment, right? You need it as equity, you need it as debt, you need it in all sectors. So any foreign fund is really not going to be comfortable until we have a transparent, efficient, or becoming efficient process and a disciplined process. So, having been here 12 years before there was any of this here, seeing it now, it's been incredibly transformative. I'll also tell you, it's transformative in the way we do business, right? All of a sudden, you have to roll up your sleeves and really get into these situations. You can't necessarily, stay in a larger, mature jurisdiction and sort of do these things on autopilot. You really have to be on the ground. You got to work with the banks. You got to work with the shareholders, work with the trustees. I think it's incredibly transformative.
Mm-hmm. Arvind, would you like to comment on this from the ADGM's perspective? What has this meant and how do you...
So I think Dilip touched on one of the points that I wanted to talk about, which is FDI. So what you're seeing is kind of reverse flow of capital, right? And that's been the big focus. So as the economies here diversify from oil and also diversify, from investing and exporting capital outside to actually importing capital, institutions such as ADGM, such as RDO, Hub 71, all of us are kind of towards importing that capital. As you do that, one of the things you need to have is businesses sometimes go under. It's just the way things go. Businesses have hard times. And you need to have a code that actually works for it. So UAE actually came up with its bankruptcy code, just being UAE specific for a second here, came up with its bankruptcy code back in 2016, right? But it was, I wouldn't say activated, right? And then what you saw was in 2018, 2019, a lot of that got activated. As ADGM, we've been at the forefront of that space, which is why I'm very keen, I'm sure we'll get to it, to create that center of excellence here. But what you're seeing is, to what Berke said earlier, you're seeing a lot of transactions, a lot of events that are coming up. And with all the headwinds that are probably ahead of us, I'm sure previous panels covered that. I think this is a sector where you're going to see a lot of activity. And as ADGM, at least speaking, I think we've got the regulatory framework to actually be able to combat it.
Are you already seeing this interest from international investors and from
well, I mean,
the conversations that you're having?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been quite fortunate, right? I mean, it was early this year that we came up with our new strategy, and one of the key clusters that we wanted to focus on was the restructuring turnaround cluster. And we've had some really good names come in. We've had some of the big advisors come in. We've had law firms come in. We have investors come in. So we're very, very grateful for that. I mean, of course, Dilip's a big champion. He's been around for a long time in ADGM. And I think we are seeing the development of an ecosystem, and it's not just about opportunities in the UAE, right? It's also opportunities in the broader region. I keep saying this. I mean, Miyasa is $8 trillion of GDP, right? So it's a much larger market. And if you look at South Asia and especially India, let's take that as an example. It's very similar, right? The bankruptcy code came in 2019. It's been hugely transformative, but it's not an easy place to do it either. It's not an easy place to do business. So what we are seeing is an interest from a lot of the Indian players to actually set up here and then access the Indian markets from here. So that's another piece that we are seeing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Laura, can I just add to that for a second? I mean, one thing that I've witnessed here, why are people interested to come here? Two things. The UAE is geographically blessed, right? We can talk to Australia at 7 a.m. and
Yep.
Palo Alto at 7 p.m. That's one. And look where we sit atop, right? I have this little phrase, take aim from the UAE, right? What is AIM? Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East. So look at this massive opportunity. Where is the real opportunity for the next 20, 30 years? It's in this part of the world in terms of GDP growth, job creation, the maturity of the financial sector, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Is that how you see it as well, Berkay, for you?
No, absolutely, and it's interesting because let's call it hinterland, right? It's working in different ways. Obviously, we cannot sit here and expect a wave of distress in the GCC because obviously with the strong oil prices, with some of the demographic improvements, the market should stabilize and perform quite well in this immediate region. But then you have the periphery, let's say a Turkey, let's say in Egypt, that we're different dynamics in place there where they don't have the benefit of the oil price stabilization, and here is perfect access to that region as well. I think the one next step perhaps is going to be more and more local banks using the strength of the macroeconomics to actually be more proactive in engaging with the secondary market and start selling some of their problem loans and actually let the market develop, right? Because if you look at US, if you look at UK, even if you look at, let's say, Asia, there's a very proactive secondary market in distressed credits where the bank doesn't sit around and wait for restructuring. They don't go out and litigate for years and years. When there's a problem, they just take the provisions, cut the losses, and save their time and capital on something more productive, right? That's our job to come in as distressed investors. This is what we do. We find solutions, and not every solution is a liquidation, right? Sometimes the company needs new money. Sometimes there is something else you can do. You can merge with another business, many different alternatives, and that's, I think, the next step that we would like to see in the region, and I think we are heading towards that direction, thankfully.
Yeah, do you think, Arvind, is this something where you see the direction of travel?
I mean, that's huge, right? It's a very, very good point. I mean, you saw what ADCB just did. I mean, so this is very recent news that's in the public domain. They just opened up $1 billion portfolio. And I think you're going to see more of that. Because don't forget, what happened over the last couple of years is, as we all know, there's a lot of liquidity in the banking system, right? A lot of this was artificially infused by central banks around the world. You're going to see a lot of that, with inflation especially, a lot of that, unwind, right? So you're going to start seeing, I believe, more challenges. Interest rates are going up. So you're going to see most banks doing it. And don't forget, I'm sure, Berkay, I mean, you're seeing this. I mean, also the accounting standard changes, right? With the new accounting standards that are coming in, where your reporting requirements have become a lot more stringent. Banks are going to be probably, as you said, wanting to take these off their balance sheet as soon as possible, rather than get stuck in long processes. And that's the opportunity for funds like yourselves, to come here and the experts to come in and kind of partake in those.
One thing I would add, absolutely, and it's an interesting dynamic GCC because the currencies are pegged to the dollar. Actually, what we are seeing is the interbank costs are actually increasing as well. Even though the economy is booming and obviously you don't have the same issues that you would have, like inflation, etc., the cost of funding is becoming an issue. So are you going to sit there and wait for liquidation to play out for 5 years while you're funding yourself at, say, interbank rate at 4.5%, 5%? Just doesn't make sense, right? 100%. At some point, you need to be more proactive. So we would like to, we are expecting that to happen soon.
Mm-hmm. Do you also expect this trend, or what?
I expect it. We're working towards it, but
yeah.
Look, as everybody knows, it's all about the pricing ultimately. And I still think we're in a regime where, we as buyers, we see a certain value, and the banks have a legacy way of doing things where they sit at a certain value. I haven't yet seen that inflection point. I've seen it a little more in India, where alongside their bankruptcy laws, they really accelerated the creations of those asset reconstruction companies. So those were private investors that were sanctioned. And so you would see those transactions get a little more reasonable per se, but also because there were good operating assets there, right? And it's about the asset and the value that can then be created out of that asset to the legacy investors, the new investors, the shareholders, et cetera. So I think with groups like Berkay's coming in, I'm looking forward to that help as to, let's have a reasonable dialogue around pricing.
The other thing that will help is, as there's more case studies that we see that successful restructurings that can take place, the risk premium that a distressed investor will assign to the region will actually decrease, right? So we can actually show improved pricing if we think that, the process is not going to take 5 years, 7 years, that we can come in and out of process in a year, 2 years. That changes the IRRs materially, right? Because the timing is a lot more tighter. So as more and more cases come through, and that will apply to direct lending side of things as well, right? Because you can see that there is a way to solve a problem, right? You don't have to stay around and wait for the thing to liquidate for 10 years. You're going to price it accordingly. So I think we will get there, hopefully, that we will see more and more cases, that market will kind of create more liquidity and we'll find a way to meet in the middle.
And I think you both touched on a good point. I'll give you an anecdote. Historically, these banks had sat on these portfolios for a very long time because they weren't under pressure. And I remember in 2015, we were looking at the SME portfolios because we could sense there were some issues. So I met with a bank, and we were trying to take a look at the 2015 vintage. And so they offered me 2008 for zero. And I was like, it's 2015. You're still holding 2008. I'm not taking it for zero. So, I think we're going to see a migration towards rational dialogue.
So I guess we've already touched on this a little bit, but in terms of returns that you experience here in GCC and Asia, how would this compare? Maybe we can start with Berkay, compared to other regions that you...
I would say it's been fantastic because inefficiencies in some ways help that dynamic, right? In Europe or US, every stress situation is priced to perfection because there are so many players chasing it, there's so much precedent that people just bid aggressively, while here, a lot of it is still being tested. A lot of it is still not that many players, let's be honest, that specialize in the region. So from SLO's perspective, it's been a fantastic investment over the years. I mean, we got involved in the region as early as restructurings of Nakheel and Dubai World and dry docks back in 2010, 2012. And it's been great in terms of comparing it to Europe. I would say it's been a much more attractive jurisdiction for that.
So first mover advantage for you guys.
Well, you got to be brave, right? I mean, opportunity comes forward if you're brave. So we've been lucky enough to take advantage of that for sure.
I see you nodding, Arvind.
Yep. I couldn't agree more, right? I think, I believe the region is at that inflection point, right? I think, and as I said earlier, it's not just about the opportunities in the region, which of course are very important, but it's also what you can access from the region. So it's both, right? But even if you think of the region by itself, I completely agree. I mean, I think there's that inflection point. You're also seeing, interestingly, sovereign wealth funds, in my view, is kind of some of the smartest money that goes around here. And you're seeing them starting to deploy in the sector. And that's a telltale sign, right? I mean, historically, they've started. And you're starting to see, hopefully some pretty big funds that are starting to come and domicile in the region, right? To access both the region, because as you said, there's a first mover advantage. You can come in early, you've got opportunities, but also what else you can access from this region. You've got an open jurisdiction, I mean, if you think of the EDGM jurisdiction again, I mean, we've got elements from the US bankruptcy code elements from UK, elements from Australia. So we've tried to create something that's bespoke, and hopefully we can continue to improve on it, with the help of industry participants, which is how we always do business here. But I think there's tremendous opportunity for all stakeholders, right? I think you're going to see that take off soon.
And maybe moving to sectors, what is hottest right now? Like, what's most interesting in terms of distressed debt in the region?
Well, there's no distress in the region right
Well,
now,
I
I would
mean-
say, right? I would say in terms of the opportunities, what we see is different dynamics. I think in UAE, perhaps, there's still the legacy names, as Dilip was mentioning, of a vintage or two vintages away that's sitting on the bank balance sheets. We are seeing some opportunities around those. I think the real estate side is quite interesting from more of a special sits direct lending kind of angle, because obviously banks have a certain capacity that they can lend into the sector, and it seems like we are getting close to that. So I think that's probably the biggest opportunity in UAE. If you look at Saudi banks have never been as proactive as the UAE banks in dealing with their balance sheets. So there are a lot of legacy names that have been amended and extended for the last 10, 15 years that we expect is going to slowly start coming to market. And then I think one of the most interesting opportunities in the region is in Turkey, right, where you have a large population, you have a real economy, and there's almost chronic shortage of hard currency at this stage because the banks are very reluctant to lend into businesses there. So again, to Aaron's point, here you have a very good access to that region and different dynamics in play between different countries. So instead of sectors, I think more about jurisdictions and different dynamics playing out there.
The funds that we work with and we co-invest with, we always try to look at the underlying asset, right? And we want to see assets that are strategic in any emerging markets. And if you've seen, the things we like to see, some communications infrastructure. So there have been situations where data centers that are strategic, if there's an opportunity to get involved in that. Healthcare. I think there's been opportunities in healthcare. Education. You're seeing that. Transportation infrastructure. I can't tell you how many infrastructure projects I see where you're in now a dispute, the banks are in dispute, there's opportunity in that as well. So we're looking at these kind of fundamental infrastructure assets for these emerging markets. And how do we access them through the distressed credit side?
And I think if I can add to it, I think they've covered the sectors piece. But I just want to take a step back, right? I mean, we're not just discussing distressed debt. I think if you look at special sits and you look at opportunities on private credit, because I think that's a big space, you're seeing a lot of opportunities emerge, right? Whether it's direct lending, the SME sector, not just in the region, but the broader region as well, has been largely underserved. You're going to see a lot of players going direct to consumer or even B2B in that space. You're seeing similarly a lot of venture debt ideas, especially with tech valuations and the way they've been impacted over the summer. You're going to see a lot of interest in that space. And you're already seeing that in EDGM. We've had 2 or 3 funds that have come and set up, venture debt funds. So we're seeing interest in that space. So I think you're going to see, if you look at the broader special sits area, I think there are a lot of opportunities that you're going to start seeing.
Absolutely.
That was sort of the next topic, I guess, opportunities in private credit, direct lending.
Sorry, I jumped it.
No. You're doing my job for me, that's fine.
Good segue.
Do you agree, for example, Berkay, do you think that's kind of the next area of growth?
No, absolutely. You can't expect banks to do all the heavy lifting, right? At some point, everybody, there needs to be diversified source of capital. Like a good example, for example, is in Saudi, where the CMA actually approved a framework for private debt funds, which again, 5-10 years ago, you told people that Saudi is going to let that happen. It would be a bit, considered crazy, but I think everybody realizes that you need different sources of capital, you need different profile of investors, and hammer is not the only tool, right? And not everything is a nail, so you got to find different sources of capital, and I think that will start developing more and more. And to Arvin's point, I think venture debt is a very interesting market here. Especially as direct lending, I think there is more room to grow as well. So we are quite keen to find more opportunities.
I definitely agree with that. Look, we have so much domestic liquidity in each of these jurisdictions we talked about. So the opportunity for direct lending, and also, these direct lenders in those jurisdictions, they have the expertise. They know the banks, they know the promoters, they know the shareholders. I think that's a great opportunity. And I think we're going to see more and more of it.
And if I can just add one point there, right? You add then the layer of technology on it. And I think that's what's disrupting it even more. Because you add blockchain, you add DeFi, tokenization. I think you're going to see a huge disruption in that space. We're already seeing that, right? We've had I mean, as ADGM, we already have a tokenized platform in Peregrine, albeit for alternative investments at this stage. But I think you're going to see a lot more of that coming in. And I think you're going to see the space being quite disrupted.
I think
Technology is going to be a big layer.
you're exactly, and at the end of the summer, I was in New York at an event, and JP Morgan has a team working on the tokenization of balance sheet assets so that they can securitize and bring in new credit quicker than their usual process.
Wow. Is that something you would be looking at, maybe, Berkay, or too,
Maybe.
too spicy? A bit early.
I think crypto might be the next distress opportunity set, the way things are going, so it's probably worthwhile a look.
Let's see. I think we're running out of time, but I was hoping we'd have some time for some Q&A. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. Anyone would like to ask a few? Oh, there's a gentleman over there. There's a mic for him.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Harish. I just want to understand how fair are the bankruptcy laws to the lenders, and what are the chances of the bankruptcy law being misused by the companies?
Should I take it? I would say the way I think about it is if something is an insolvency or bankruptcy, something has gone wrong, right? It can be many things. It can be misinvestment, right? Someone made a big investment, but the investment didn't come to fruition. It can be cycle, like commodity prices moved against the company. It can be fraud, right? That happens often as well. It could be one of the main reasons. Ultimately, the point is not to kill the company or kill the sponsor, right? The point is finding a solution that's commercial for all the parties, that maximizes the recovery from a lender's perspective, gives the business a chance to survive. Sponsor has to sacrifice a little bit as well, because obviously they are the ones who are managing it, and not to be value destructive to the economy. So can the bankruptcy process be misused? I think it depends on what you define as misuse, right? If there is a process where the sponsor is taking away too much from the table, that means that the lenders have to be more aggressive and ask more from the counterparty. But ultimately, the key is to make sure that the business survives and the lenders get their recovery, and sponsors put something on the table as well, because they are the ones that cause usually the issues. So as long as the jurisdiction is in good place, as long as the trustee and the court do their job, which they do, I don't think it can be misused. I think there's going to be a solution that's not going to be great for the lenders, because usually you will be impaired, but there will be a fair solution that will be commercial and reasonable for all parties.
Anyone want to add anything from?
I think we're living through so much transformation right now and precedent being set, right? So questions like, is it unfair to the lenders? It also depends which lenders. Is it the legacy lenders? Is it the new money lenders, right? And we are living through these scenarios right now, and everyone's going to have a different perspective on what is fair and unfair. Now, without a process as we had before, we never had, I call this now the moment that the gladiators are in the ring. This is the first time when everything is being aired. And great, make those accusations in the ring and sort them out in the ring. And talk about, bankruptcy, the laws being misused. Think about the misuse and abuse before there were bankruptcy laws, right? We've clearly seen situations where there's an asset, there's a issue in the life cycle of the loan, and someone else wants that asset. I think the opportunity for abuse and misuse was far greater before we had legal process. But time will tell, right? Some people are going to say that was unfair. Some people would say that was unfair.
So I think we've got time for one more question. One more question. Anyone have any questions in the? Oh.
Hi. I was wondering if someone would answer Daniel's question. Are we in for an epic default cycle, and how far away are we from that? What do you expect to see?
What part of the world are you talking about?
Yeah.
This part of the world?
Crystal ball time?
Well, yeah, I don't think there's going to be, in GCC, no, there's not going to be a big default cycle. I think what we might see is if the previous approach has been just amend and extend, and the debt buildup was just adding on, and there's a mountain of debt, with just the base rate rising, that cost of servicing the debt is becoming uneconomical, right? There has to be a more commercial solution beyond just amend and extend, because that's what the times are calling. So in GCC, I think that's the only pressure point that I see for the companies here, while perhaps in Turkey, we might see a wave of defaults with what's happening in the backdrop there. There are different jurisdictions. I would say anybody who has to import energy at a large scale is probably going to struggle a little bit, but I don't think we will see a wave of default, at least in the region and in the hinterland.
maybe if I could add to it, Dilip. I think, if you look at it even pre-pandemic and the stimuluses that came through central banks, we were largely living in a triple B world, right? So a lot of the companies that were just managing to stay relevant from a credit standpoint. I think, that kind of extended through the pandemic, thanks to all the liquidity. But you're going to see a lot of those kind of starting to have default, especially with rising interest rates. I tend to agree with Burke. I think in the region, I think I kind of call it a Goldilocks moment for the region. I think we are having, high fiscal kind of, positive balances, and we're doing quite well. But if you look at it globally, or even regionally, and you add Turkey, Egypt, so if you're an energy importer, or even for that matter, a commodity importer, in general at this stage, you're in for some trouble.
All right, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Thank you so much to our panelists for having this discussion with us, and yeah, give a round of applause.